Okay, hello everybody. I've just received a notification to say that this is being broadcast live. I can't see anybody, so of course it's really bloody peculiar. So I have no immediate feedback to sort of to gauge how I'm sounding, how I'm looking, or how I'm coming across in any kind of way. But anyway, I hope I'm sort of coming across fine, and that you can hear me fine, that you can see me fine. My name is Wajid. I'm a sound artist. I am Manchester born. I'm London based, and for the last few years I've been working on the Tape Letters project, which is something that I'd like to share with you. The plan for today's talk is to sort of to go through some background of myself. In fact, what I'll do is let's just leap straight into this. I hope you can see this fine. This is fundamentally what the project's about. It's about shining light on the use of cassette tapes by British-Pakistanis when they first came to the UK in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And the schedule for today's talk is going to be just basically for me to give you a bit of background in terms of what I do and what we do as Modus Arts. Give you an idea of the kind of work that we've undertaken on the project, including the pilot and where we are currently. And then what I'd like to do is to demonstrate our online exhibition that we've developed on a WebXR technology, where this is going to be our sort of first public outing of the thing. So we're not entirely sure how it's going to pan out, but we're very looking forward to sort of seeing whether this works as well as we hope it will. And then we're going to have a bit of a space for a Q&A session, right? So this is me. This is kind of how it all started out 20 odd years ago. I was sort of involved in experimental music making. I released quite a few albums and various performances. This is me and my best friend Alice Kemp, sort of being silly buggers backstage in Berlin as part of a project called Uniform, and various sort of sound installations and performances here you can sort of see. And Modus Arts, we essentially specialize in sonic arts practice, right? So we sort of shifted from music making into sound art as a discipline. And I became sort of interested in all the other creative possibilities with sound. So obviously, composing music and composition is one way of thinking about what can be creatively done with sound, but I really sort of tried to push at the edge of what was possible creatively with sound. So multi-speaker installations, lots of sort of interdisciplinary collaborations. I run a deep listening workshop for children, which have been running for a good few years. So I mean, you can sort of get the sense that I'm very interested in sound and it as a medium, as a creative medium, right? But you're here to find out about tape letters, and this is really how the project came about. This is my father. He passed away about 20 odd years ago, and about 5 years ago, I went up to Manchester to look for one of his cassettes, and the reason why I mention that is that he was a Naat Khan. So when he came over to the UK, he brought with him this love for singing a devotional hymn called the Naat. And we'd have people come to our home when I was a kid, you know, in Manchester. He'd wanted to listen to him singing, and he would be invited to other people's homes, you know, to sing. And we were sort of, as kids, we were, asked to sing along with him in mosques and various places too. And it got to the point where people were asking him to record these Naats on cassette tapes, just because it was really convenient for them to listen to him singing in their own homes, right? So he'd record these things on tape, and then obviously just pass them to various members of the community, right? And so that's what I was looking for. I wouldn't mind playing you a little clip of one of these cassettes of his, right? Just to give you an idea of the kind of singing style that he did. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether the sort of sound is streaming through fine or not, but fingers crossed it's working fine, right?
मेरे अजीज दोस्त ने फरमाइश की थी कि कुछ तसव्वुफ गल हो जाए, तो मैं जरा तरीक चीज पेश करना है, इश्क और अकल, उस तो बाद चंद के शार पढ़ना, फिर उनका कर पूरा हो जाए। इश्क उठियासी रचना रचांद लई, इश्क उठियासी रचना रचांद लई, अकल आ फड़िया सूली चढ़ावद लई, अकल आ फड़िया सूली चढ़ावद लई, अकल दा घर ज़मीं इश्क दा घर फलक, अकल चले भी की नूर वाली झलक, इश्क दे फरमा बरदार हूरो मलक.
Okay, so these were the kinds of devotional hymns that were on these cassettes, right? And about 5 years ago, so I was sort of desperately missing, his voice, right? I wanted to sort of reconnect with his voice, and I went to my mum's home in Manchester to look for one of these cassettes, and of course I found one of these tapes, but I also found these. These are not tapes. These are something else, and in fact, that says "Dudise Grelomate" in Urdu, and that means the chatterings of Dudi village. And that's Ami Janki Bate, I think it says, and Zerina Dal. I knew these weren't not tapes, and they're certainly not sort of pop music tapes. And in fact, as soon as I had these in my hand, I realized I had something that was really quite significant, but it wasn't something that could be transposed into a work of art. There was something a lot more significant about these tapes, right? And the Arts Council, who are sort of the people that I generally approach when it comes to funding any project, weren't the right institution for this thing. In fact, it's these guys. It was the Heritage Fund that were the right people for it. And in fact, that's what I realized, was that this could potentially warp into become a heritage project, not only sort of a Pakistani story, but a British story at that, right? And as part of framing the project to them, we had to come up with some obvious clear aims. And the aims were for me to initially create an archive that we wanted to essentially have a place where we could have these cassettes in a centralized location, so an actual archive, because for the most part they were just in people's attics or in bags, in carrier bags or whatever, right? Most of them actually, they were thrown away. But any of the ones that were remaining, I wanted to have a central place where we could store them. I wanted to create intergenerational dialogue around this particular practice. This was a practice that was deployed by people like my mum of that generation. It wasn't deployed by people like me, and it certainly isn't something that my son Isaac knows anything about at all. But I thought it would be really interesting, certainly in terms of heritage and identity, to have these multi-generational discussions around migration, which of course became one of the themes that sprung out of this thing, and alongside many other really interesting themes, which I'll talk about. I wanted to frame this use of cassette tapes as a parallel form of comms, alongside letter writing and the occasional phone call. That the cassette itself was a really valuable and really critical form of comms for many people. And one of the key things I wanted to do was that normally when a particular community is targeted for any kind of information, when you're doing any kind of research, whether that's along ethnicity or sexual orientation or whatever it is, a particular community, usually it seems to me that a lot of the kind of information is just placed in an archive, and then really only made accessible for archivists and special interest groups. And one of the key things I wanted to do this time around was that if we were drawing this information from, from from these Asian elders, that we would make sure that we would reflect it back to them properly, right? And to do that, we needed to do it in the language they speak, and they don't speak Punjabi. The vast majority of people that were using these tapes, we understand that South Asian languages are extraordinarily diverse, right? And I grew up thinking that I spoke Punjabi, but in fact, it turns out that I speak Potwari. And Potwari is an oral-only language. It's a very interesting thing that it sits in between Punjabi and Hindko, these two other languages, right? But it's a language in its own right. So this is what we were able to achieve, right? We actually have the archive. This exists now at the Bishopsgate Institute, which is an extraordinary archive here in London. As part of the pilot project, we managed to source 22 cassettes, and we undertook 34 interviews. We created a whole lot of outputs, like a website, obviously, and we put on some amazing exhibitions in Manchester at the People's History Museum, and here in London as well. We had a footfall of about 21,000 people, which is remarkable for any exhibition, let alone a kind of an oral history project, and a whole lot of really interesting stats. We built in trust within the, I think this may be a bit of an overstretch to say that it's within the British-Pakistani community, but certainly within the people that knew about the project and that contributed as donors. We sort of built in trust for various reasons, because these cassettes themselves contained extraordinarily private messages, really not made for anybody else's ears, certainly not ours, right? And we managed to establish a team of translation guys in Pakistan, and I'll explain why that was really critical to the project, right? So here's what we found. Here's some of the examples. This is my mum, and in one of the interviews, she mentioned that that in her situation, what had happened is her in-laws had sent her a really horrible letter, and I think there was kind of all sorts of real issues for women of her generation with in-laws at the time, especially if the men in the partnership came over to the UK before them. So they were kind of living with their in-laws, and there were kind of, we found at least, many instances of people that were ill-treated, right? And so they carried on with that ill-treatment to her when she came to the UK about 6 to 7 years later after my father arrived, right? And they knew that she couldn't read or write Urdu. And so it was relayed to her by my dad. And she was infuriated, and she said, okay, listen, I'm here in my own home now. I'll show them what's what, right? So she responded by tape, right? So she recorded this response and sent it to a relative of ours. She basically gave it to a relative of ours who was going to Pakistan. He found out what was on the tape and brought it back, right, before they'd even listened to it in Pakistan. And she was furious. I mean, absolutely furious about this. So she sent it in the post to bloody make sure they got it, right? So it was a really interesting example of how extraordinarily important it was for people like her to have their voices heard, literally heard. Their voices were heard, right? And it was, because of these cassettes that was able to happen. These guys, this is Asim on the left, and this is Asma on the right. Asim was Bradford born, and Asma is Gujar Khan born in Pakistan, which is a district of Rawalpindi. And these guys sent tapes to each other right until the 90s. So they were kind of quite unusual because it's quite late in the day, because by that point, obviously telecoms had sort of kicked in. And so it was relatively easy to call, call Pakistan from the UK. The reason why these guys used tapes, though, was privacy. So they had telephones in their homes, but they had no way of actually speaking to each other. And the reason why they wanted to speak to each other intimately is because these guys were destined to be married, right? And so they started sending tapes to each other every 3 weeks for about 3 years. And this extraordinary interchange of tapes that sort of flying between these two, for all this time, And as you can imagine, it was just riddled with, you know, aching young love, right? Really desperately dramatic love, you know, and in some cases, sort of sexually explicit material. And they've been extraordinarily kind enough to be able to give us 3 cassettes each, you know, and we've got them in the archive. Of course, we've been extraordinarily careful about what we relay. So that thing I mentioned earlier on about trust in the people that that have contributed to the archive, this is a perfect example of what I mean by considerable levels of trust. But their stories are extraordinary, and they essentially fell in love on the tapes. You can hear it. You can see this sort of unfurling of their love on the tapes. Sarwar, she's based in Greater Manchester, and the interesting thing about her was these cassette tapes, they were obviously developed for repeated listening, right? I mean, this is kind of why tapes were there. You listen to them again and again and again. For her, she could only listen to them once or twice because there was a limit to how often she could hear her mum crying. So we started sort of uncovering these, as you can sort of see here, there's a listening behavior here. And previously you can see these recording behaviors. We started sort of teasing out these really interesting themes that started appearing as we analyzed what we found. Qamar here, her story was slightly tragic in that, well, we know that many of these tapes were just missing, right? And part of the reason why they were missing is that people like me, when they sort of saw one of these cassettes, I'd be like, oh, great, I'll have that. I'll use that for music, right? I'm just record off the radio. And in many instances, obviously, you know, people just put these in bags and just left them in the attic, and just after a while, they've just thrown them away because they weren't that particularly valuable, right? But for her, what happened is that her mother, who was in Pakistan, and she was based in Bradford, Qamar was, she sent Qamar a tape saying, look, I've been diagnosed with leukemia, come to Pakistan, I'm going to die. I don't have much time left, right? And Qamar was, she was pregnant with her first child, Saad, at the time. And so she couldn't go. And by the time she did go, her mother had actually died. And she's been looking for this cassette, this message of like saying, come over, and she's not been able to find it. So this is kind of an extraordinarily sad story around her aching, and she's still trying to find this cassette that doesn't exist anymore. We also uncovered lots of really interesting themes and ideas around identity. These 3 guys here, there's my 2 brothers and my sister. I mean, that's perfect 70s sort of attire, isn't it? Like that. And one of the sort of interesting things that I sort of recall as well is something along sort of Sarah's lines. I've been sort of asked to sing the national anthem of Pakistan. Of course, we had no idea about partition or independence, you know, which way of the divide you want to perceive it from. But we had no idea that Pakistan was India. Right, and we had no idea about the importance of the national anthem for Pakistanis and why it existed in the first place. We didn't really know what the words meant, right? We kind of knew the melody, something like that, but we just recite this stuff, and we'd be sort of singing this thing because obviously it was really important for our parents to hang on to that idea of us being Pakistanis, but we weren't Pakistanis, right? We're actually Brits, and so this idea of the British Pakistani identity appeared when we arrived. I think these guys here, they didn't really see themselves as British. They saw themselves as sort of as Pakistanis in Britain, right? We were different. We were the Brits here with this dual sort of makeup, and it's obviously very complex and it's intersectional. We know that for sure, and lots of different people have different ideas about kind of, you know, how they identify. But this is very much the beginning of the British Pakistani identity. And we've got all these kind of really interesting stories of like, you know, yeah, you can hear the sort of the class roots, and then maybe you can hear my own class roots, right? But you can hear class that's encoded on these recordings too. This is a really interesting aspect of the project too, is that that many of the people that recorded these cassette tapes were, for the most part, women, right? And the reason why it was women who recorded these cassette tapes was because it was women who were unfairly treated when it came to education. people like my mum, and this is my mum's sister, who actually took a divergent route to a divergent migratory route, right? So my auntie went to Canada, and my mum came to the UK. These women weren't allowed any access to education, and it's relatively recently that I found out that what they really mean was primary school, like primary school, right? And that's simply because they were girls. Their brothers all had access to schooling, and that injustice has stayed with them. Like, still to this day, as we interviewed these people, they still feel the burn of that, right? And so part of the reason why people use these tapes was just simply a necessity, to sort of stay in touch. And of course, when people like Zarina migrated to Canada, there wasn't that much of a sort of a community that she could connect with. So she felt desperately alone, right? And I think she sort of relays how difficult it was to feel so isolated when you have come from an extended family model, right? So these tapes were a lifeline for a lot of people, right? We've also found some really interesting usage of cassette tapes, which we are not going to pass on. This particular tape, the only reason it's been handed over to us is on the back of the agreement that nobody can listen to this thing, and nobody can read the transcripts for 50 years. Which means it's an extraordinary object in of itself, right? So one of the things that we started uncovering was essentially some of the kind of archival practices of how we deal with something like this. Do we include it or not in the archive? And in fact, we decided to include it in the archive as a really interesting example, of some of the behaviors around it. And I've listened to this thing. I can kind of understand why this needs to be kept private. And I hope you sort of accept my apologies for not relaying any of that. Of course, migration is kind of really key to this project. This picture here on the left-hand side, this is a photograph of Azad Kashmir, which is the Kashmir on the Pakistani side. I visited Kashmir when I paid a visit to India when I was backpacking in India for a year. I went sort of traveling on my own when I was about 25 or so. So I've been on the Indian side of Kashmir and on the Pakistani side of Kashmir. And when I was on the Indian side, I stayed for 2 weeks in a place called Srinagar. And it's only about a year ago that I actually found out that my family were originally from Srinagar, actually, and that they migrated from Srinagar to this area in Gujar Khan, and then, of course, sort of came to the UK. But we've got all sorts of really interesting other migratory sort of stories and migratory routes, right? So obviously migration stories are never A to B, it's one-to-one. There's all sorts of really interesting dynamics along all the way, We, of course, and actually surprisingly for us, started uncovering some stories around partition of India, which we didn't expect to look at all. And one of the interesting things that we sort of got to grips with was the power of oral history as personal testimony, and essentially how that triangulates anything that we can understand through the textbooks, right? So sort of formal understanding of history. So of course we have, and to give you an idea of this place itself, this is my mum's home in the village. It's a village called Dudi. So with that cassette tape that I talked about earlier on called Dudi Se Giranobate, right? This is Dudi itself. There's about a cluster of about 7 houses. And this is the house she grew up in, and this is where she'd send some of the cassettes back to, back to Pakistan. And she, I think she must have been about 10 when sort of partition happened. But she doesn't have any understanding about, the British presence in India, why they were there for so long, right? They were just the established ruling elite, right? She doesn't have any understanding about the Britain's involvement in the Second World War, and much of that is actually, hidden from us too. People like me who were born here, I had no idea about any of this stuff, right? So if I didn't know anything about it, she certainly was, less likely to know about it, simply because her inability to be able to read, right? These things are relayed to her in some way as part of that oral tradition. She doesn't know anything about the Radcliffe line, but what she does remember is the smell of partition. She remembers villages burning all around her, and the extraordinary terror that was involved in that. And we know how bloody that was and how extraordinarily difficult that was for that landmass, to have gone through that. And some of the interviews that we've undertaken, I mean, people like my mum are fairly stoic people, right? So when she talks about this stuff, she's just like, okay, this stuff happens, right? Life and death happens. Some other people that we interviewed, as soon as we came close to this particular subject, they were like, the interview's over. We're not going to talk to you anymore. It's just finished, right? And we understood then how something like this is still carried by people of that generation. This is proper trauma, and it's encoded in them. And it's an important thing for us to try and interview these people and get their testimonies about how it actually was for them, right? And it's not to say that we should discount history books, right? Of course, they're extraordinarily important, but it's when you hear individual and personal testimonies that's when it comes alive, right? So this was a really unexpected area for us to go down. Of course, I didn't want to lose sight of tape culture and kind of, I'm a sound artist first and foremost, so I was kind of very interested in the physicality of tape itself, right? But essentially, the development of the cassette tape technology was the thing that facilitated this as a form of communication, right? So I think human beings are sort of generally good at reappropriating things, right? And obviously, cassette tapes weren't made for comms, right? They were made for music, music media. But these guys reappropriated it and used it. And in fact, we had even instances of people using quarter-inch reels where they'd take domestic reel-to-reel tapes on flights to Pakistan and record family members there and bring them back, So some interesting sort of stories around that. Of course, we looked into language, and I mentioned earlier on that I speak Potwari, which I didn't know. It was called Potwari. And so we've been in touch with some extraordinary academics, linguists who really know their way around this stuff, and people who've done social-linguistic surveys. Lothers and Lothers were the people that really fired me up initially, but we've been sort of since. We've been in discussions with Dr. Farah Nazir, whose PhD was specifically on light verb usage within Potwari. So these guys really know their stuff, and it's really fascinating to really touch on the subtleties of the language itself. And one of the sort of core questions was, look, I mean, do oral-only languages, are they sort of susceptible to evolution in a way that's different from written languages, right? Do they evolve quicker, right? Do the word usage, does it drop really quickly, So all of that became really quite interesting. We, of course, had problems, right? The problems were, how do we make an oral-only language accessible? The solution we came up with was to transliterate using Urdu, right? So this is an example of an interview that I undertook with a guy called Mohammed Zareen, who's based in Ashton on the Line. And you can see here we've sort of time-coded the transcript on the left-hand side and an idea of who the speakers were. And in Urdu, which is written and read from right to left, that says, Beli cheeze dostana na gave. And he responds, Mara na Mohammed Zareen. And you can see the sort of transliteration here in English, which is Beli cheeze dostana na gave. Mara na Mohammed Zareen. That doesn't make sense in English, right? That's just a sort of a phonic version of the language. That's exactly what we did here. That doesn't make sense in Urdu, right? In Urdu, that would be Hamara naam Mohammed Zareen hai, or something like that. I'm not a native Urdu speaker, but it would be that, right? But if you can read Urdu, you can get closer to the phonics of it in the same way that you can do here. And then, then obviously we had the thing translated, right, for it to make sense. And that meant that, we had multilingual access to this thing. But of course, it's a massive undertaking, right? It took a huge effort to sort of do this. And which is, when I mentioned that translation team in Pakistan, you can kind of get an idea of why. If you think that this is like 2 minutes of an interview, and we had, you know, X number of cassettes and X number of interviews, how long that sort of took, you know, and the endeavors that we did. But what it did is it provided us with all this extraordinarily rich data. And we used a bit of software called NVivo, which is essentially allowed us to sort of form it as QDA, qualitative data, that we could then draw out specific themes. And I'm not entirely sure whether you can actually see this or not, but essentially we could say, okay, what were the sort of early experiences of people in the UK? And anybody who talked about that would be tagged under that particular theme. Essentially, it's tagging. That's what it was. We're able to tag all the themes, all the content, all the audio, all the actual text itself, right? And we were able to tease out all these themes. And through them, because of them themes, we're able to create the archive itself, you know. And here are some of the exhibitions. You can see the iPad app, you know, this is the archive, and all sorts of really brilliant events that we could do. And this was the event that we did at the People's History Museum in Manchester. And you can see this circle of speakers here. That's kind of my thing. You know, I love doing diffused sound pieces. But what we created were 5 sound vignettes, 5 sound poems that were inspired and derived from the archive itself, right? And this exhibition was on for a month. It was chosen as part of the PHM's community project for 2018. What we were also able to do was things like this. We held private events for people that had, you know, some of the people at least that had contributed to the archive. And that thing that I mentioned earlier on about making sure that we didn't exclude the people that had contributed to the archive. People, you know, like these guys here, you know, they never set foot in exhibition spaces. You know, exhibition spaces, they're not for them. They're not made for them. You know, but this thing, this sort of, you know, we were able to relay their stories in their language, right? And so, and you can see, you know, you can see the circle of speakers here from this particular view. We have people crying in here. We have people laughing in here. I mean, that's art, right? That's kind of what art, I think, in one of its best senses. It doesn't have to all be publicly, you know, satisfying, engaging in that way. You know, well, that's very complex, but in this instance, that's what I was looking for, and we were able to achieve that. So this is where we are now, right? We've been sort of, we're close to the end of this iteration of the project. We have the Heritage Fund, who've been kind enough to be the primary funders for this thing, and the Arts Council have joined in. In fact, we've also have the Audio Content Fund, who've actually since joined us. So we'll be creating a few radio programs on the back of this thing. I'll not go through all of these aims. We're essentially going to be doing more of the same. It's what we have done. We've looked deeper into the project, uncovered more themes, looked into more other languages beyond Potwari, of course. And there's all sorts of, you know, we actually, one of the interviews was in Pashto, or Pakhto, and it was really interesting looking at the Pakhtun, you know, society and some of their culture. Yeah, and we're working with a kind of a wide range of, you know, artists to help sort of realize this, including poets, you know, and digital designers and whatever. I'll skip all the problem stuff. We were hit by an extraordinary number of problems, least of all COVID, right, and the lockdown. I'm gonna oral historians love how we managed to get around all of these problems, but what I will relay is an interesting aspect of the project which helped us carry on with the work, right? This is the mic set that I used on the pilot project, and this is a kind of professional level broadcast quality microphone, lavalier sort of set, right? This costs about £1,200, so it's quite expensive bits of kit. We knew that we had to undertake these projects, the interviews remotely, and that we had a team of about 8 of our community engagement people undertaking the interview. So what would have meant 8 for them and 8 for our interviewees, that sort of would have come to about £23,000, which we couldn't afford, right? So we developed our own mic set. So this was we actually incorporated a mic called the Clippy EM172, and we're proud of having to track this thing down. It's developed by a company called Fell Communications, and they're like a boutique mic manufacturer based in Middlesex, right? We were able to create this set for about £100, and we could afford 25 of these, right? So we made that many and distributed them to our team, and of course all the people that we want to interview. And here we go. This is kind of on the right hand side of these grabs. You can see our team, and these are some of the people that we've interviewed, and you can see that they're all sort of wearing our mic set. And so we were, able to carry on with the work and sort of uncover, all these remarkable stories, right? And of course, these audio packs were being sent to Leeds and to Halifax and to Bradford and to Birmingham, to, all over the place, right? So we had a bloody complex tracking thing. And we've made this mic pack openly accessible, so that other sort of audio historians and other people who are interested in undertaking interviews are able to do it. And it's relatively, like I mentioned, it's relatively affordable. So anybody's interested in finding out more about this, just obviously let me know. But hopefully, if you want to take a screen grab of this, feel free, right? These are some of the photographs that I took myself as part of the pilot. And they're okay. I mean, they're not sort of professional level photographs, but they give you an idea of the kind of thing that I was looking for, which is essentially a close-up of the person. You understand that they have a relationship to the cassettes themselves because their voices are on these things. And in some instances, I take photographs of their homes and provide us a bit of a context to who they were. But we've been fortunate enough to hire an extraordinary photographer called Maureen Wahid, who's been going around taking some remarkable photographs. So we're sort of putting on some really amazing exhibitions. And in fact, we've used many of her photographs in our digital exhibition, which I'm very looking forward to sort of showing you here. But you can kind of see the quality, the difference in quality, So we've really upped how we can present this thing, I think. Just before we go into the actual the gallery, the online gallery itself, I'd like to sort of relay the story of one of our interviewees. His name's Karamit Iqbal, and he's based in Birmingham. And he came over to the UK with his father and his sister. And his father returned to Pakistan sort of not too long after they arrived. So I think Karamit and his sister lived with their uncle. And what would happen is that the father and the mother would send Karamit these tapes when they were separated from each other. And in fact, Karamit's relationship to his father was just entirely built around him listening to his father and his mother on these tapes, right? So they were very much his understanding of his dad was very much encoded and fused into these cassettes themselves, right? And so it was a kind of certainly a remote and slightly distant sort of relationship. And in fact, he mentions here, as a child, you may remember the imaginary friend, but my imaginary friend was my father. And it's an extraordinary thing to realize that the cassettes itself took on this kind of representation, right? And of course, in some way, like when his father passed away, these were the equivalent of his father's ashes, right? He still holds his father's voice bound to the actual physicality of these tapes, right? So what I'd like to do is to, because we couldn't put on any exhibitions this year, we developed an online exhibition using a web XR technology. It's called framevr.io. And what I'd like to do is to, first of all, demonstrate the, how the thing works. And then what I'd like to do is, I don't know whether this is possible or not, but and given that I don't have any kind of immediate feedback from you guys, so I don't know whether who's able to jump in or not. But essentially, what I'd like you to do is to use a Chrome-based browser and type in this URL. So it's framevr.io/tape letters -Psalm21. Not yet. If you just hang on, I'll give you like a little bit of an instruction on this thing, and then I'll invite you all in. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing this thing, here, and I'm going to jump onto Frame VR, and then I'll try and share that, and hopefully it'll all work fine. Okay, so just give me a moment. Let's see how this works. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and it'll be Brave tab frame. I'll share the audio now. I'm hoping you can see that. And let me just close this one down. And I'm just going to log in. So it gives me some administrative access. Okay. So hopefully what you can see here is our online exhibition, right? And you can see here we have in this room, should we say, 5 plinths, right? You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they all contain documentation of this particular project. You can see, obviously, it's all housed in one room with a wooden floor. And I can navigate through this space as an autonomous avatar, right? So I'm using my my cursor keys on my keyboard, you know, up, down, left, and right. Up is for forward, down is back, left is strafe left, and right is strafe right. Now, and you can use your mouse to sort of to look around as well, right? Now, if you're a gamer at all, you know that actually WASD is another way of controlling and navigating through spaces like this. So it'd be W is forward, S is back, A is strafe left, D is strafe right, and Q and E are spinning around. So Q is look left and E is look right, right? So I will just show you this. First of all, I'm going to show you that. Here we are. Look at some of the videos that we've created. And there's all sorts of stuff that's going on behind these plinths and behind these walls. And what you can do is, obviously, you can go right up to these plinths and sort of see what's going on here. And what I can also do is to flick into a different scene, right? So you can see how we have this particular scene, and I'm now going to flick into scene 2. And you can see actually it's exactly the same layout, but we have different content here. And if you do jump in, can I ask you to name yourself? At the moment, I think everybody's automatically named as being anonymous, but I think you may have the option to name yourself. It'd be lovely to have you jump in. We're going to keep this frame, we're going to keep it open, so you can jump in anytime you like. But it'd be really quite nice to sort of see people jumping in. And you can see over here, remember the Asim and Asma story that I mentioned earlier on, these guys that use cassette tapes, you know. What we've done is we've essentially have the clip here of the actual cassettes themselves, right? And what I'll do is I'll play you one little clip of Asim's cassette. Oh, Asma's actually. And the interesting thing was that we actually paid these guys a visit 25 years later and got them to recite their audio from this cassette in English, which was a little bit awkward for them because they didn't actually feel the same way anymore, right? They sort of got a couple of kids now, and they're like, well, we're not desperate teenagers anymore. Nevertheless, you know, we managed to sort of get them to relay, you know, their tapes, right?
My heart, my darling, my soulmate, my body, my happiness and my go-go, my dear Asim, Assalamu alaikum. How are you? I hope you are doing well. I got your cassette and I had tears in my eyes.
It wasn't easy to get, to get to that, right? But we have it. And yeah, and essentially, I think I think this quote sort of talks about it, frames the project perfectly. Like, photographs have become evidential when the sound of faceless loved one comes floating out of the speakers. They are an oral snapshot, a memory of a memory that we can open up and listen to at any time, right? We've created a third and final scene of credits, and we haven't included any images in this final scene because we wanted to just have the credits of all the people that were involved. We thought we'd sort of here on this particular plinth by name. And so this is all the people that were involved in the pilot project in 2018. And these are, these are the people that were actually supporting us as partners on this thing. And you can see here in 2021 all the people that were involved in the project this time around. So it includes obviously Sam, and there we go. So so yeah, thank you very much for obviously being here. Sorry, just give me one moment. I'll just close that door. Thank you very much for for obviously spending the time to hear this talk. Of course, feel free to jump in on this URL. So it's framevr.io/tape letters-psalm21. Of course, it'd be lovely to have some of you guys sort of jump in real time so we can see how it actually works. But I think it might get a little bit sort of it might get a little bit tricky. Yeah, so let's jump out of this actually, and let's return to StreamYard, maybe for a sort of a Q&A. Now I'll stop sharing on this and see how that pans out. Okay, stop screen share. Okay, so I'm sort of I'm back here. Yeah, obviously I'm getting a notification here from Sophia that it's sort of working fine. So I'm glad that all sort of worked. It worked okay. I came through fine. Okay, Sophia, I'm not sure whether you can sort of see me at this point. I think this is the kind of the inevitable strangeness when there isn't kind of anybody to speak to directly. So we're not really entirely sure whether we're sort of talking into a void at some point. But maybe given that there isn't anyone that I can see at the moment, maybe we should sort of call it that. We have a website up and running, so obviously if anybody wants to get in touch with us, you can do. It's tapeletters.com, and of course social media, it's just hashtag tapeletters. And yeah, I think maybe let's just end it at this point. Thank you very much for your attention. Here we go. The time frame of the tapes, 70s, that's right, it's 7 to the 90s actually, yeah. And in some instances, late 60s, because actually the tapes themselves, they're developed in 1963, the technology, and of course that was around the time when a lot of people sort of came over from Pakistan and migrated over to the UK around that time. So yeah, between 60s and right up to 90s, we do have some instances of people beyond the 90s, but it's very rare. Okay, I mean, to make me sort of Yes, I think maybe we should end it here, Sophia. Yeah, I can see your message here. Yeah, let's do that. Thank you so much again, for your attention, and of course, thank you for South Asian Heritage Month for inviting me to do this talk. That's a project we're, of course, very proud to be associated and be involved. And yeah, anybody wants to get in touch with us, feel free to do so via the website. Okay, thank you. Bye for now.